Good morning. This is going to be the first tape for the last testing period, hurrah, of History 2303, Texas History. We're going to talk about Texas during the Great Depression, 1929 to 1941, the Depression years in Texas. This morning, on October the 24th of 1929, a panic seized the nation as the New York Stock Exchange crashed on that terrible Thursday, October the 24th, 1929. The crash of the stock market initiated the beginnings of the coming of the Depression, beginning again October 1929. Texans who were invested in the markets were immediately affected, but the problems which arose after the fact with falling prices, declining business activity, rising unemployment, increased bankruptcies, etc., caused the Great Depression eventually to reach each and every town and every farm in America, including to the north, the south, the east, and the west. It would take several months before the Depression mentality would affect Texas because of the physical distance between the New York, where the Depression began, with the collapse of the market in October of 1929. It would take months before the Depression's effect would be felt in Texas, and the very last part of the nation that would be affected would be the western parts of the nation, i.e., the Depression would finally even reach California and the west coast of the United States. President Herbert Hoover was president in October of 1929 and oversaw the collapse of the economy, unfortunately for Herbert Hoover, because immediately Americans began to say this downturn in economic activity is a result, well, it's Herbert Hoover's fault. It happened on his watch as President of the United States. So the word Hoover became villainous in American history, with people talking about losing their homes and having to live in makeshift shanties, which they referred to as Hoovervilles. A Hoover blanket was yesterday's newspaper that poverty-stricken people who had no means of or nowhere to live would spend the night on park benches covered with yesterday's newspaper, which they euphemistically referred to as Hoover blankets. And the word Hoover carried a very heavy and negative connotation into the American language. But that's because Herbert Hoover didn't understand that the depths of the coming of the Great Depression. Actually, the man did more to forestall the coming of economic hard times as president during his watch than any other previous president had done before that. But unfortunately, what Mr. Hoover did came up short. For instance, Herbert Hoover believed in voluntarism. He believed that in a declining business environment, if big business would continue to produce as if nothing was wrong with the economy, and they would continue, for instance, General Motors would continue to produce automobiles, eventually the American people would wake up one morning and say to themselves collectively, why in the world is General Motors continuing to produce automobiles if in fact the economy is as bad as we thought? Perhaps the economy is better than we thought, and maybe the problem is not with the economy, maybe it's a crisis of confidence, i.e. between our ears, and there's really nothing wrong with the American economy at all. So Hoover, in his philosophy of voluntarism, asked big businesses not to lay off workers, not to curb production, but to continue to produce as if there were prosperous times, in the hopes that somehow the American people's psyche could be changed, their attitudes altered, and one morning we would all wake up and say, wow, there must not be anything wrong with the economy. The problem must be between my ears, and I have had a wrong attitude about America's wonderful economy. Nothing, perhaps, showed Herbert Hoover's lack of sympathy for unemployed Americans than the Bonus Marchers episode of 1931. With so many Americans out of work, large numbers of young folks, i.e. World War I veterans, were also thrown out of work beginning in 1929. At the end of the First World War, a very grateful Congress of the United States had decided that it was going to give a bonus to every veteran of the First World War. And the Congress decided that since times were good, that the government of the United States would wait until 1944 to give every veteran who had served in the armed forces of the First World War a bonus. And in fact, by 1931, there were tens of thousands of these former World War I GIs who had lost their jobs, couldn't support their families, and large numbers of veterans began to physically go and march on Washington, demanding that Congress give them their 1944 bonus early in 1931 when they needed the money. You know, a lot of these veterans said to the Congress of the United States, I and my family may be dead, having starved to death during the Depression. We don't need that bonus in 1944. We need it now in 1931 when it counts. But the police chief of Washington, D.C. believed that it was an unsafe environment to have formally trained veterans descending on Washington, angry at their government. And indeed, the police chief of Washington, D.C. believed that these bonus marchers, as they would refer to themselves, seeking an early payment of the bonus marchers, former veterans of World War I, were communist-inspired. The police chief of Washington, D.C. went to General Douglas MacArthur, who was at that time in charge of the United States military, and General MacArthur believed the police chief of Washington, D.C. MacArthur, in turn, went to the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, and claimed that the bonus marchers were communist-inspired. And if you ever want to see something that will make you absolutely sick to your stomach, watch the film, the 1931 film of the United States military with tanks and hundreds of troops with fixed bayonets, physically pushing the bonus marchers out of their little Hoovervilles that they had established near the White House while waiting and lobbying the Congress of the United States for an early bonus. It will make you sick to your stomach to see how the American government treated the veterans of the First World War. Most veterans were driven physically out of Washington, and with only a handful of veterans remaining, when Congress finally made a decision about an early bonus, and Congress turned down an early bonus payment for the veterans, the remaining veterans who were still in Washington, D.C. gathered on the steps of the national Capitol. Did they protest, and did they threaten violent action in return for what their government had not done for them? No. These were veterans, and these were honest, loyal Americans. And the veterans who remained after Congress rejected an early bonus for the World War I veterans sang patriotic songs and pledged their loyalty to the government of the United States, who had turned its back on the bonus marchers. Herbert Hoover also distressed Americans by 1931 when he called a press conference, and the president piously announced, "No one's starving in America." And social workers in urban cities throughout this country could have taken Mr. Hoover at that time to see thousands of urban families that were literally starving with no means of support. So Herbert Hoover was out of touch with the American people. In 1932, in November of 1932, the people of America turned and elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat from New York, as President of the United States. Roosevelt's domestic policy would be called the New Deal, because what America needed was a new and different deal in the relationship that government had with business and people. For the Republican presidents that preceded Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s, during the decade of the 20s, the prosperous 20s, the Republican presidents used what was called trickle-down economics, that the government of the United States had an obligation to assist big business in the creation of jobs, and that eventually the creation of jobs would slowly but surely trickle down to the little people, i.e. the American electorate, and that was the way that government assisted the American economy, through assisting big business. But Roosevelt said, with so many Americans out of work now by 1932, I want a new deal. I want the government of the United States to directly assist Americans in need. After he was elected as the president-elect in November, it would be March of 1933 when Roosevelt would take office. He had about 4 months, and Roosevelt, during these 4 months, after his election as the incoming president of the United States, but before the inauguration, talked to a number of economists about how to stimulate the American economy. For every economist that he talked to, he got a different rationale about how to resurrect the economy. But the one economist that made sense to Roosevelt was John Maynard Keynes, Keynes. John Maynard Keynes said, Mr. President-elect, there are only 2 ways to stimulate the economy. One, the people have to spend money to stimulate business growth. But if the people of America can't, or for one reason or another, now with heavy unemployment, a lot of people didn't have surplus money to spend on consumer goods. The only other option was for the government to spend and stimulate the economy. No doubt Franklin Roosevelt said, but Mr. Keynes, if people are out of work and they can't pay taxes and the government's not raising money, then the government doesn't have money to spend to stimulate the economy. And John Maynard Keynes' response must have been, then spend it as if the national government had the money in hand. John Maynard Keynes is today known as the father of deficit spending, and deficit spending started during the New Deal of the 1930s. The New Deal emphasized relief, recovery, and reform of the American economy. Relief, recovery, and reform, the 3 R's of the New Deal. The New Deal was designed to create what critics referred to as alphabet soup agencies. Agencies of the United States government that would appropriate money and put unemployed Americans to work. In agriculture, that was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. That for industry, it was the NRA, the National Recovery Act, that set up the National Industrial Recovery Administration. For unemployed Americans in urban areas, there was the Civilian Conservation Corps, where unemployed young men in urban areas without much hope for the future could join the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and be taken out in the countryside, out of the environment of the city where they could possibly get into trouble, and plant trees and do conservation activity in rural areas of America. They would earn very little money, but 20% of what they would earn every month would be withheld from their paycheck, and that money would be sent back to their families in the cities. So that even if it was make work, these folks who had no opportunity of employment in the cities could now work for the CCC and partially assist their families back in urban areas. But the New Deal failed to restore economic good times. And God knows we needed it. By the 1932 election, one out of every four Texans were unemployed. Texas had a 25% unemployment rate, and that was about as high. Well, there were some areas of the country, including Toledo, Ohio, that had an 80% unemployment rate. but 25% of all Texans were unemployed. Family income had declined by 50%, while U.S. corporate earnings declined annually from $10 billion down to $1 billion a year. And the truth is that the economy never recovered. By 1937, in the midst of the Depression, 1937 was a recession year, and the economy went backwards in a sense of improving. It declined by 1937. Texans were hit hard during the Depression years of the 30s. An unemployment census for Texas in 1933 showed 105,000 Texas families. That was 7.1% of Texas's population on relief. But by 1934, there were 246,000 families, 13% of Texas' population on relief. Commodity prices dropped so severely that cotton was a staple crop of Texas. Cotton that had sold in 1928 at 18 cents per pound dropped in value by 1932. Cotton, a pound of cotton, sold for 5.5 cents a pound. And that was 5.5 cents a pound in 1932, when the United States government estimated that in order to break even, cotton farmers would have to be paid between 7 to 8 cents a pound just to harvest and make a slight profit on their crops. So even if the crops were harvested at 5.5 cents a pound, farmers were going further into the hole every year. Conditions were so bad that the Texas Old Age Assistance Program, and we had an old age assistance program for those over 65 years of age, went completely broke with so many unemployed older Americans, Texans, on relief. Things were so bad that in East Texas oil declined from 60 cents a barrel down to 5 cents a barrel by 1932. One West Texas town, Abilene, a citizens' relief association, killed, dressed, stored tens of thousands of wild rabbits. There are a lot of rabbits out in West Texas. And the citizens of Abilene rounded up and killed and cleaned and stored for the unemployed rabbit meat. Aransas Pass fishermen donated tons of fish to feed Dallas poverty-stricken urban residents. In that environment, soup kitchens and bread lines quickly are overwhelmed. Most churches operated soup kitchens for the unemployed, but pretty soon churches didn't have enough money to provide food, even one meal a day, for so many Texans that were down and out and needed assistance. Texas farm laborers tended to quit the farm, seeking jobs elsewhere, particularly in Texas towns, but merchants and shop owners laid off many of their own workers, causing massive urban unemployment. Texas unemployed often hit the roads trying to go to other states of the Union. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath about Arkies and Okies, Arkansas citizens and Oklahoma citizens who traveled all the way out to California seeking jobs. But by the time that unemployed Arkies and Okies and Texans had made the long trek to California, the Depression had gotten to California and there were no jobs to be had. And so those unemployed had to make the long trek back home without ever finding economic prosperity. Black Texas unemployment was roughly twice that of whites, and a large percentage of Tejanos, Hispanic Texans, were on unemployment assistance. In fact, the percentage of Hispanics on unemployment and public assistance exceeded all other minorities in the state of Texas. In fact, conditions were so bad, and with discrimination being the way of life in the 1930s, many Texas Hispanics were even deported to Mexico due to discrimination and the hardships during the Great Depression. Local schools and governments were visibly affected. By 1932, the city of Houston had to turn off half of its streetlights at night because they simply didn't have enough funds to electrify and to light up the skylight of Houston each night. Beaumont in 1934 virtually closed its public libraries and cut city school funding in half. Female school teachers in San Antonio, whose husbands earned a minimum of $2,000 a year, were not rehired purposely so that jobs could go to unemployed heads of households. So if you were a San Antonio female teaching in the public schools in San Antonio, and your husband had a separate job and made $2,000 a year, you lost your job. The number of Texas churches that closed their doors during the Depression, 4,000 churches simply financially could not sustain their operations and went out of business. Demonstrations by the unemployed in Houston occurred in 1930 and in Beaumont in 1931. And San Angelo sheep shearers and pecan shellers in San Antonio also struck for higher wages. Violence occurred during the 1930s Great Depression. The most notorious Texas criminals some of the most notorious of all Texas criminals operated during the Depression, including Dallas's Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, who, until their deaths in Louisiana in 1934, at the hands of Texas Ranger Frank Hammer, Hamer, Bonnie and Clyde robbed banks in Texas. They were just two essentially uneducated Dallas residents who said, there's got to be a better way. If we're going to lose our jobs, then let's earn money the old-fashioned and easy way. Let's steal it. And so Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker went into the business of robbing banks. And some of you have perhaps heard this story from me and other classes, but it says something about the impact of the Great Depression when Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker decided that they would go into the business of robbing banks. The very first bank that they robbed, Bonnie drove the getaway car. Clyde, walked into the bank with a shotgun under a long trench coat, and he told Bonnie, "Keep the car running. I'll be back in a minute." And pretty soon he comes running out of the bank, pointing a gun at the bank door to keep people from pursuing him. He jumps into the car and he goes, "Go, go, go!" And Bonnie Parker speeds away from the site of their first bank robbery. But Clyde has a weird look on his face, and Bonnie goes, "What?" And then she learns that Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker had robbed one of those 5,000 banks that had gone bust after the collapse of the stock market, i.e. the first bank that Clyde and Bonnie Parker robbed had no money in it. And you know that times are bad when criminals rob banks that don't have any money in it. So that's an interesting story, but a true story about Clyde and Bonnie Parker, who were two of the most notorious criminals that pursued, throughout Texas for their brief career. When I grew up in Rosenberg, Texas, there was a story that circulated that in the Brazos River bottom that Clyde and Bonnie Parker had a hideout in the Brazos River bottom, and that as a courtesy, when they were in town, they would telephone the local police, and the local police would get the hell out of Dodge because these were hardened criminals that had killed a number of individuals. When I moved to Kerrville, I was told that Bonnie and Clyde had hideouts in the hill country of Texas, and that when they were present there, that they would, as a courtesy, call the police and say, "Why don't you guys disappear, because we don't want to have any trouble with you." And when I lived in Austin, I heard that there were stories that Bonnie and Clyde had hideouts near Austin, and that, again, they would call the local authorities and say, "Hey, we're in town, so why don't you just disappear? We don't want to have any trouble with you." Frank Hammer, Texas Ranger, trailed Bonnie and Clyde into Louisiana, set up a roadblock, and when Bonnie and Clyde came driving up to the roadblock, Frank Hammer and about 5 others used submachine guns and shot Bonnie and Clyde about 500 times each with submachine guns and killed them. One could argue that that almost constituted murder, but what kinds of folks were Clyde and Bonnie Parker? So hard times begat hard scenarios during the 1930s. In the face of this economic and social turmoil came state elections in 1930, and the public sought a leader who would take action against the Depression. In the Democratic primary for governor, 12 individuals filed, including former Governor Miriam Ferguson, former Ku Klux Klan United States Senator Earl Mayfield, Tom Love of Dallas, and Ross Sterling, who was chairperson of the Texas Highway Commission. It was Sterling who was a former president of Humble Oil. Sterling was Governor Dan Moody's choice to succeed him as governor of Texas, since Sterling ran as a business progressive who favored economics and government and advocated a massive bond issue to improve immediately Texas's road system. Ma Ferguson actually led in the May primary over Sterling by some 70,000 votes. But in the runoff election in August, Sterling defeated Mrs. Ferguson by over 100,000 votes. How did Sterling, who was down 70,000 votes, wind up defeating Mrs. Ferguson by 100,000 votes? It was because 12 individuals had filed for Democratic governorship, for the nomination for Democratic governor. And the 11 losers to Mrs. Ferguson, including Sterling, all said, "Wow, we don't support Miriam Ferguson. If we support Miriam Ferguson, the Fergusons will go back into the Texas governorship. Now, we better all, the losers in the May primary, we better all endorse Ross Sterling." And as a result, Sterling overcame a 70,000 vote deficit to defeat Mrs. Ferguson by over 100,000 votes. Sterling's administration from January the 31st, January 1931 through January 1933 was one of constant crisis as state income fell and state expenditures as always. An allegedly do-nothing legislature rejected both a state income tax bill and a state relief effort to help unemployed Texans. The governor, to hold down expenditures, had to veto over $3 million worth of legislative spending, and oil and gas problems continued to plague the state of Texas. In October of 1930, Columbus Marion, nicknamed Dad Joyner, drilled the first producing Kilgore, Texas oil well. By the time the major companies had become interested in the East Texas oil field, independent oilmen owned 80% of that field. This massive East Texas oil field would produce a peak total of 205 million barrels of oil in 1933, helping the poorest section of the state, East Texas, too quickly. Wells went in at a rate of 1 well per hour in the East Texas oil field. By October of 1931, land was leasing for $30,000 an acre in Kilgore, Texas became Sin City overnight. But that massive output of oil dropped by 1931. The cost of a barrel of oil that had been in 1930 $1 a barrel to only 8 cents a barrel by 1931. The major oil companies and conservationists as well approached the Texas Railroad Commission about overproduction in the East Texas oil field and the possibility of the destruction of the field's water and gas drive. And so in April 1931, the Texas Railroad Commission issued a proration order. Proration is P-R-O-R-A-T-I-O-N, a proration order for East Texas, which limited daily production. But many independent oilmen ignored the order or either sought an injunction against proration. When the major oil companies, which owned the refineries, refused to buy East Texas oil, independent oilmen built refineries of their own. 95 small, what were called tea kettle refineries, turned out low-octane gasoline that was trucked and sold to independent gas stations throughout Texas. The trucker's cargo was deemed hot oil that was produced outside the refineries of the major oil companies. Independent oilmen held meetings but could not agree to voluntarily prorate production. So on August the 17th of 1931, Governor Sterling declared martial law in the East Texas oil fields, ordered ceasing of all oil production, and sent the National Guard under the leadership of General Jacob Walters, who happened to be a former Texas Oil Company attorney, into the East Texas oil field. Given Walters and Sterling's ties to major oil, independents saw the governor's action as a blatant effort to ruin the independent Texas oilmen. The East Texas oil field opened in September of 1931 with the allowable proration of only 100 barrels per well per day. Yet hot oil sales increased, illegal pipelines sales continued to independent gas stations. Violence occurred as efforts were made to identify who produced the hot oil, who transported it, how much hot oil was being produced, and if the appropriate taxes and royalties had been paid on it, and who transported and sold it to independent stations. The Texas Supreme Court in February of 1932 ruled that martial law by Sterling over the East Texas oil field was unconstitutional. But nevertheless, the governor kept troops in East Texas until December of 1932. In February of 1933, the Texas Railroad Commission then lowered the daily proration rate to 75 barrels per well per day. But in October of 1933, a United States federal district court order ruled the order illegal on the grounds that it discriminated against wells with high production capacity. Governor Sterling then called a special session of the Texas legislature, which passed a law specifically allowing the Texas Railroad Commission to prorate the existing market demands. Texas Railroad Commissioner Ernest Thompson asked for and received a force of Texas Rangers to stop the flow of illegal hot oil. By December 1933, East Texas oil fields had a semblance of uneasy order. Subsequent federal legislation under the NRA and the Connolly Act made it illegal to transport hot oil over state lines. And by 1939, the major oil companies, which only owned 20% of the East Texas oil field when it first was developed, wound up, by 1939, the major oil companies wound up owning 80% of the East Texas field, with only the strongest independent oilmen surviving. In creating the image of the independent Texas oilman and established Dallas as the headquarters of the independent oil operators. East Texas never forgave Ross Sterling for his actions in declaring martial law over the East Texas oil field and changing the ownership of the East Texas oil field from 80% owned by the independents to 80% owned by the major oil companies. A crisis also loomed in agriculture, and it was a problem that had the average farmer literally needing 3 times the amount of production that he had had in 1928 to pay off the same amount of existing loans. North and East Texas farmers suffered the most, and Congress created the Federal Farm Board, which authorized the Cotton Stabilization Corporation, and in Texas, a Texas Marketing Association with 47,000 members was also organized. Cotton's falling prices and overproduction remained a problem. In 1930, the Texas cotton crop had 4.5 million bales of surplus cotton, only to have the 1931 crop become the second largest crop ever in the history of Texas, with an additional 17 million additional bales of cotton baled in that year. Voluntarism, diversification of crops, and 1/3 plow under of existing agricultural cotton fields was advocated. When Texas farmers asked Governor Moody to call a special session to pass a cotton reduction law, Moody refused when he was governor, alleging that such an action would be meaningless if not undertaken by other U.S. states in the South that grew cotton. Sterling then inherited the farm crisis. Sterling actually called a conference of Southern governors in 1931 to consider agricultural controls and limitations on the amount of acreage under production. When 5 other states and Texas agreed to drop their acreage production, the idea was criticized by other southern states and those in ancillary cotton industries such as shipping, ginning, and merchants who saw in cotton reduction a restraint of trade, a restraint of business trade. However, Governor Huey Long of Louisiana adopted a no cotton crop plan for 1932 to go into effect if other southern states did likewise. A special session of the Texas legislature was called to consider the no crop concept, rejected Long's political schemes, but cut the 1932 cotton crop to 30% of what the 1931 crop had been, and placed fines on Texas farmers for overproducing. However, it's one thing to pass a law, and it's one thing to get the public to obey the law. And most Texas farmers simply refused to cut back production. Why? Because farmers feared that the cotton crop would be productive the following year, and if they cut their crops, they would cut the amount of productivity and not make money. In February of 1932, a Texas cotton reduction plan was declared unconstitutional by the state courts. In one other way, Texas attempted to get rid of its overproduced cotton. The Texas Highway Department built experimental roads with a road base of cotton saturated heavily with asphalt as a gravel substitute. The experiment failed, however, when huge chunks of road base began weeks later to peel up, causing massive chuck holes the size of automobiles in Texas roads. And very quickly, the Texas Highway Department decided that the use of cotton-based roads was inappropriate. Sensing great public dissatisfaction, once again, in November of 1932, Miriam Amanda Ferguson declared for governor, and Jim Ferguson, her husband, declared, 2 years ago, you got the best governor money could buy. Sterling was worth about $50 million. This year, you have the opportunity to get the best government patriotism can give you, quote unquote. Promising to pick up chips and bring in water for Ma, Jim Ferguson attacked the actions of Governor Sterling. Even though most politicians endorsed Sterling, The governor lost to Miriam Ferguson by 3,798 votes in the August runoff. But history records that over 100 Texas counties had voter discrepancies, with the total number of votes cast for Ferguson and Governor Sterling in the August primary exceeding the number of poll tax receipts in the entire state. So there was an enormous amount of graft and corruption. Both sides claimed victory, but Miriam Ferguson came out on top. And so in 1933, Miriam Ferguson would return once again as governor of Texas. The 43rd Texas legislature refused to adopt Miriam Ferguson's request for a 3% sales tax to generate revenues for the state in the face of a $14 million state deficit. So desperate for the legislature to generate revenues that laws were passed legalizing horse racing and prize fighting in the state of Texas. Significantly, the Graves-Woodruff reorganization bill made more efficient the bureaucracy of the state failed in the legislature. Mrs. Ferguson urged the legislature to create a Texas Rehabilitation and Relief Commission to distribute federal funds and oversee the passage of legislation authorizing in Texas the sale of 3.2% beer after Prohibition was ended. Although less controversial than her first term in office, Miriam Ferguson's second administration was noteworthy when Ma went back soon to a very liberal pardoning policy for convicts. She also issued special ranger citations to 2,344 of her closest friends, i.e. people willing to buy a commission, while dismissing 44 long-standing Texas Rangers, building what critics called a political machine. Jim Ferguson and his appointed Texas Rehabilitation and Relief Commission appointee, Lawrence Westbrook, were accused of playing politics in the dispersal of federal funds. Should we have been surprised? By 1934, Texas State Senate investigation forced Westbrook's resignation, and mindful of the next January 1935 legislative session and the potential for impeachment, Miriam Ferguson announced her decision not to seek re-election at the end of her term of office. During this time, Jim Ferguson continued to control federal highway monies in Texas, failed. So anti-Ferguson Texas Highway Department officials worked with United States Bureau of Public Roads United States Bureau of Public Roads officials to prevent the appointment of a Bureau of Roads Regional Director for Texas. Ex-Congressman Fritz Lanham, the brother of Frank Lanham, the pro-Ferguson Highway Commissioner back in Miriam Ferguson's first term, that had been forced to resign in disgrace over suits brought by Dan Moody in 1927. Fritz Lanham, former congressman's this effort to block Ferguson's control of the federal highway funds cemented the relationship between Texas officials, specifically the Texas highway engineer and future A&M president Gib Gilchrist, and the chief of the United States Bureau of Public Roads, Thomas McDonnell, a relationship which brought Thomas McDonnell to A&M in 1955 and resulted in the birth of the Texas Transportation Institute at Texas A&M. At this point, I want to close this tape, and this ends the first tape of the last testing period. And for now, I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Thanks.